website.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Trauma Informed Workshop. We will begin in a couple of minutes here. I should drop that in the chat. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Trauma Informed Workshop with Joseph Palombo. We will begin in a couple of minutes. Good evening, everyone. For those of you just joining, you are at the Trauma Informed Workshop with Joseph Palombo, and we will begin in about 1 minute. It's 5 o'clock, so we'll wait about 1 more minute to make certain that everyone who registered was able to join.
May 16th.
In the race for governor, Republican candidate Jesse Sullivan unveiled his education agenda.
Okay.
Okay, so good evening, everyone. I'm Michelle Curtin Stewart, and I have the pleasure of serving as the 8th president at the Institute for Clinical Social Work. That's all I'm going to say this evening. I am going to actually turn the virtual floor over now to Andrea Hall. She is our Associate Director of Admissions and Enrollment. Andrea.
Hey, Dr. Stewart. It is so nice to be here with all of you. Again, my name is Andrea Hall. I am the Associate Director of Admissions and Enrollment Management at the Institute for Clinical Social Work. And first, I want to just give you a brief overview about the Institute for Clinical Social Work, or as you'll hear me refer to as ICSW for short. So let me share my screen with you. 1 moment.
It says it'll stop my sharing screen, so I guess.
Can everyone see?
Yes, Andrea.
Perfect. So again, we are the Institute for Clinical Social Work. We are leaders in psychodynamic graduate education. We were founded in 1981, and since then we have been a leader in specialized higher education for excuse me, for counselors and therapists. We are a private, independent, and fully accredited by the Higher Learning Commission. And some of our values include social justice, diversity, and compassionate practice. We offer 2 graduate degree programs. One of them includes our Master's in Clinical Counseling and Psychotherapy program. This program is ideal for recent graduates and professionals already working in social services or any capacity like schools, community organizations, that sort of thing. Our program offers students an opportunity to learn psychodynamic principles and apply those principles to a broad range of practice settings, including schools. Clinical training that you'll receive in the program include courses taught by practicing clinicians, one-on-one consultations with faculty, and you'll do 2 clinical internships with top agencies. Our master's is a 2-year degree program, 60 credit hours. Classes meet Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, so it's very flexible. We offer full-time and part-time enrollment status options, as well as flexible learning modalities, including distance learning and a hybrid model, meaning that you would, for the most part, do the program online, but be required to come to campus once a semester. And then we have a fully on-site or on-campus option as well. Our PhD in clinical social work is a doctoral program designed for practicing clinicians. Coursework incorporates clinical preparation, theoretical study, research experience, and elective classes. And our PhD students receive one-on-one guidance from our expert faculty, which advances each student's clinical and research skills where it matters the most in their practices. Our PhD program is 3 years. It's again with the learning modalities. So the PhD distance cohort meet Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then the on-site cohort meets Fridays and Saturdays. Again, we offer full-time and part-time options for more flexibility, as well as distance learning and on-site. In terms of our admissions requirements, we do require 3.0 GPA or above. Officials transcripts have to be submitted, resume or CV, personal statement, and then if you're applying to the PhD program, we require a philosophy statement and baseline state licensure. In this case, Illinois, so that could be LCP, LSW, that sort of thing, as well as an application fee. And we are still recruiting for the fall 22 admission cycle. So if you're interested in applying for fall 22 admissions, we are accepting applications until May 30th. If you have any questions or just want more information about our graduate programs, I know this was a very short presentation, please feel free to email me at ahall@icsw.edu. So I'll leave that up for a couple seconds. So if you want to grab a screenshot or something, feel free to do so. Okay. And so now, one moment. So this evening, I also have the privilege of introducing to you our workshop presenter, Mr. Joseph Palombo. In 2014, the Institute for Clinical Social Work established the Joseph Palombo Center for Neuroscience and Psychoanalytic Social Work to honor Mr. Palombo for his dedication and devotion over a span of his 55-year period of career to the improvement of the lives of children, adolescents, and adults with neurobehavioral problems, and to furthering the education of clinical social workers. As you know from reading Mr. Palombo's biography, he is the Distinguished Director Emeritus of the Joseph Palombo Center and the founding dean and faculty member of the Institute for Clinical Social Work, and has a range of other noteworthy accomplishments and contributions in the field of social work. So this evening, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Joe Palombo to you all.
Thank you, Andrea. You have to see how do I get control of this screen?
You should just, you should see share screen. Excellent.
Okay. Can everyone see this?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you much. And welcome to all of you. Very much appreciate your, I can't see my picture or the pictures. Is that, okay. I assume you can see me also? No?
Yes, we can see you.
All right. I assume you have registered for this seminar because of your interest in trauma. I wanted to have a sense of the participants that registered. If you could indicate how many of you are classroom teachers, how many may be social workers or psychologists. Could you see how are we doing this?
Joe, I can, if you are a classroom teacher, raise your hand and I'll take note of that. And thank you. Some people are putting it in the chat. Thank you. Why don't you put it in the chat? Thank you.
Okay. So we have one social worker, teacher, social worker, teacher, teachers. And all right, so we have a fair number of counselors as well as classroom teachers. The reason I was asking is because some of this material may be complicated. Some of it is more applicable if you are seeing kids individually as a social worker, rather than having to deal with the kids in the classroom. So I'm going to try to cover both, and there will be time at the end. I'm planning on having a half hour of question and answer period, and we can cover. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat. I'll try to check and make sure that I can address any questions that come up during the presentation. All right, so the first, oops, well, I have to make this, okay. So as I try to think about how to be of help to you in terms of dealing with children who have suffered a trauma. I wanted to preface all of that by saying it's hard to distinguish from a child's behavior whether the underlying cause of the behavior has to do with having suffered a trauma, or whether it's a behavior disorder, or it has some other source. In any case, what I want to convey to you in this seminar is that if you have a fairly deep understanding of what trauma is about, what it does, how it affects people, you may be able to distinguish in the classroom whether a child's behavior is motivated by the trauma they've suffered or by some other reason. In any case, those of you who are social workers will have access to much more information, which will be helpful to you then in understanding what's going on with the individual child. So as you think about dealing with the children, keep in mind that the possibility that that child has suffered a trauma in the population of the schools that you serve is probably higher than usual. So with this, I'm going to go on with the formal presentation. If I can get my gadget to. So the one thing you need to keep in mind is that trauma changes not only how we think, what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. As I will illustrate in the rest of the talk, major changes occur in people who have suffered a trauma that are difficult to reverse, and they carry those scars with them throughout their lives. And so understanding how they have been affected really would give you some clue as to how you can help people. I'm going to cover 4 major topics. 1, the types of trauma. 2, what kind of behavior manifestations you can expect from children who have suffered a trauma. 3 is the body of the presentation. How our physical bodies respond to trauma, what kind of changes occur that will reflect themselves in the behavior that the kids will manifest in how they think and how they feel. I'm going to touch on how changes in the brain occur, which are much more permanent and which really follow the child throughout their life. The third area is the psychological impact of trauma. And finally, I have a large section on some interventions to ease the effects of trauma. We'll have some extended time on those. And I hope also during that period, we can have some questions and answers. So first of all, what is a trauma? A trauma essentially is a subjective experience. There's no objective measure to decide whether a person has suffered a trauma. You know, just from the overt incident to which the person have, you cannot tell whether that traumatized them or not. A trauma psychologically, subjectively, is essentially a disruption that occurs in how a person feels, how they perceive what's happening, how they experience what's happening, that sort of turns their mental world upside down. It's a highly impactful event that leaves its scars and its effects for prolonged periods of time. Now, basically, we can talk about 3 types of trauma. There's the single event, there's complex trauma, and there's what I call cumulative trauma. So in single trauma, what we have is one major event, like witnessing a drive-by shooting, or a school shooting, or being raped, or being in a life-threatening car accident, or losing a parent or a loved one. These are single events that leave their mark, and we will talk about the effects these have. Another category of trauma is what we call complex trauma. And it's important to make that differentiation. In complex trauma, there are multiple incidents of sexual abuse, severe neglect, maltreatment, or exposure to domestic violence. Most of the kids suffer from complex trauma, certainly in the populations that are in the schools. There may be a few that have had one single incident that has impacted them. But for the most part, I think many of them have had prolonged histories of being exposed to neglect, abuse, or to serious domestic violence or other types of violence from their environment and where they live. Cumulative trauma is a different category. You know, I like to say that cumulative trauma is, as the saying goes, a death by 1,000 cuts. It's like repeated incidents that erode the sense of self, erode your self-esteem, and sort of make you feel little, make you feel exposed. So chronic shaming, bullying, discrimination, or even academic failure, or even physical illness. These are not as dramatic as one would think about, you know, sexual abuse or neglect. They may be minimal. You may think, you know, the child sort of can get over them, and you may overlook them, but they leave their scars just as much as the other incidents do and traumas do. So keep in mind then those 3 categories. However, just let me emphasize, we're going to talk about some of the behavioral manifestations, and it is hard to distinguish whether a child has suffered from category A, category B, or category C. Unless you know the child and you know the history, you may not have a clue as to what type of trauma they have suffered. So keep that in mind. So moving on to the behavioral manifestations that you can expect from kids who have suffered trauma. And here, you know,
exciting, important.
I think somebody has their, would you mute yourself or is it? Okay. So the behavioral manifestations, the common ones, and I'll talk about each of those separately. The first is the feeling of loss of safety. The world is no longer a safe place for the kids. The second is manifestations of aggression or emotional meltdowns. The third is chronic anxiety. The fourth is difficulty paying attention and concentrating to the work at hand. The fifth is disrupted relationships, peer relationships, relationships with adults. The sixth may be withdrawal. And the seventh is something that we will address repeatedly, confusion about what occurred. We're going to talk about the difficulty in giving a narrative as to what has happened and the difficulties involved, no matter what type of trauma. Articulating what has happened is a problem which we have to understand its origins. So, I will weave in, as we talk about the responses, some of the behavioral manifestations I just talked about, and we will come back to those when we talk about interventions, because the interventions are very closely tied to those categories of behaviors that I just listed. So for now, I want to address the responses to trauma. And again, the responses, whether it's a major trauma or a complex trauma or cumulative trauma, there are three categories of responses that we need to attend to. One is how your body responds. Two, how the brain changes, how the brain changes as a result of trauma. And the third is the psychological responses. So in considering the body's responses, we're going to talk about 4 different changes that occur as a result of trauma. I'm going to mention the amygdala, which is a function of the brain, which we will call the smoke detector that lights up whenever you feel danger. The second, we'll talk about the stress hormones that are generated when you suffer a trauma. The third is how your autonomic nervous system responds. And then the fourth, we will deal with the fight, flight, and freeze responses. So I'll take up each of those in some detail so that you can have an understanding of what occurs. And these are all related to physical responses. Now, don't get intimidated by looking at the brain. Think of it as an image that characterizes what goes on inside of you. Here, there is this body in the brain that we call the amygdala. And in our field, regarding trauma, we call that our smoke detector. Okay, what happens is whenever you experience something, whether it's real or whether it's imagined, whether it's external or internal, that brain organ lights up. What it lights up, it sends a signal that there's danger here. Something is going to happen that's not good. Okay, and so whenever you get scared, what happens is your amygdala sort of takes note of that. And then what it does is it sends a signal to another part of the brain that sends a signal down to the parts above your kidney. We call that the adrenal glands. Now, the adrenal glands do two things. They secrete adrenaline. You know about adrenaline rush when you get into a situation where you get highly excited or highly scared. You get this rush, your face gets flushed. All of a sudden, you know, your body seems to be on fire. Part of the hormones is also cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone, and we need to understand what that stress hormone does to you. The stress hormone then shoots up into your bloodstream, okay? So that, again, there is this rush of hormones in your bloodstream, and you begin to feel that something is happening of major proportion. Now, part of what happens when your adrenaline and your stress hormones get activated and sort of flood your system is that a number of things happen. If it's sustained for a long time, your immune system gets compromised. We will also talk about when the brain gets flooded with cortisol, some of the things that happen there that will leave their scar and carry over for a long period of time. So we're talking about the stress hormones, and I want to give some detail about what happens when you get flooded with these stress hormones. There is the nervous system, which we call the autonomic nervous system, has two branches. One branch is called the sympathetic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and that gets activated. When that gets activated, here's what happens to your body. Your heart starts racing, your breathing increases, you start sweating, your hands start shaking, your liver starts pumping out glucose because you're going to need all the energy that's accessible to you to deal with what's happening. You know, your saliva and digestion shut down, your pain tolerance increases. I'm sure you may have heard of people who are in serious accidents and they do something heroic because they're not feeling the pain immediately of the injuries they have suffered. And then lastly, your bladder muscle relaxes, and you know, some people lose control of their bowels or of their urine. So all of this that's happening in your body is preparing you to either fight back to the threat that you're confronted with or run, okay? As this, your body is now ready. You can fight or you can run, okay? Now, what's important is that children are often in situations where they can neither fight back nor run, okay? So what happens when you're cornered and you're faced with a threat and it's something that you can't deal with? What happens is, we call it the freeze response. You freeze. It's the deer in the headlights kind of response. Some people call it the possum response. In terms of our evolution, animals have learned that if you play dead, you're not going to be attacked. So the freeze response is essentially a way of saying to whatever is endangering you, stop, I give up, I'm dead. So we call that immobilization. We call it freezing. It's fainting, shut. We shut down. And then, of course, when it's a very threatening situation, we lose control of our bowels. I see that there's something in the chat. I guess, okay. It's not something I need to address. All right, so let's review a little bit. You're faced with a threat, your amygdala lights up, your smoke detector will tell you there's a danger. There's this adrenaline rush and the stress hormones that are generated. Your autonomic system gets into high gear and you are prepared to fight or run or freeze in order to avoid the consequences of the threat. Okay, so now, so far, this is in summary what happens to your body when you're faced with danger. It's much more complicated. However, I think this is an outline that would be useful to you to understand, because that sets the stage of how we're going to respond to a threat or to a child who's been traumatized. Okay, we need then to understand also what happens in the brain as a result of trauma. Two things are going to be important. One, your amygdala, we will say, hijacked your cognitive processing. And secondly, your memory system is going to be disrupted. So, what happens when you're confronted with danger that is so overwhelming is you stop thinking. You cannot process what's going on. You only react. Your feelings are flooding you. Your anxiety is over the top. You are feeling so endangered that you are unable to process what's happening. So the result of that is that what is left for you as markers is fragments of the event, images, sounds, smells, sensations. You're not processing cognitively. All you're doing is processing in terms of your feelings. And so what happens when that occurs is the following, and that's a very important thing to remember. We have, again, in our brain, a little organ that's called the hippocampus. That little organ is responsible for laying down memories. The way we remember long-term memories, not short-term memories, is that this organ sort of gets activated and sends signals to the brain, which stores in different parts of the brain what is going on. So it's a very important little organ in terms of building images and memories of what you're experiencing. Just to sort of illustrate what's happening right now, as I'm talking to you, And as you look at these images, your short-term memory is activated. However, in part, you're drawing from that short-term memory back into your long-term memory so that you can access what's going on later on. The organ that's responsible for translating the short-term memory to long-term memory is this little guy, which we call the hippocampus. Now, when you suffer a trauma and the stress hormones that we talked about flood the brain, those stress hormones cause death of cells in the hippocampus. The significance of that is that your hippocampus cannot function properly when you are under that kind of stress, so that whatever is being laid down as memories will be fragments. You're no longer able to take the continuity of the whole thing that's happening to you. All that you're going to be able to do is capture images, as I said, smells, tastes, sensations, things that are episodic and that sort of get latched onto and get stored. So what that's going to mean is that when you ask somebody what happened, they will not be able usually to give you a coherent account. It'll be a fragmented account. No, they'll remember bits and pieces, and then you ask them again, they may retrieve another piece which they left out the first time, so that they look confused. And that has a lot of complications in terms of people who are reporting, rape or sexual assaults because they can't remember exactly. And, people then question whether it's happened or hasn't happened. It has happened. It's the storage of the memories that is incomplete. It is not that it did not happen. Okay. So keep this in mind, because when we will talk later on about trying to reverse some of the effects of trauma, asking somebody to tell us what happened is only part of what needs to happen for us to be able to help that person. All right, now, just to review, the amygdala hijacks rational thought and your memory system is disrupted. So next, we go to the third component. We talked about the brain changes, the body changes, and now we talk about the psychological changes that occur. Okay. One of the first feelings when you've been traumatized is you lose the sense of safety that you formerly had. It's like, a child is innocent until they're traumatized, and then the world is a different place. The world is no longer safe. But, we don't know where dangers are lurking. And so this has multiple consequences that we will talk about. Leads to difficulties regulating emotions and behavior. We're going to talk about hyper alertness and pervasive anxiety. We're going to address the problems of inattention concentration, because that's an important one, especially for classroom teachers. How relationships get disruptive, and how narrative confusion, the inability to make sense of what happens, then follows. So, as the image indicates, feeling of loss of safety. It undermines the feeling that the world is a safe place. It's like you're always looking around for where danger lurks. It's around every corner. You cannot predict when or how you might be assaulted. And so you're always on a fight, flight, or freeze mode. And you're constantly alert to the possibility of a repetition of the trauma. In complex trauma where kids have been abused or seriously maltreated, you're always on guard, fearing that the danger will be repeated or the trauma will be repeated. Then, especially for classroom teachers, I think regulation of emotion and behavior is really at the very top. Kids will flare up. The child may be highly reactive to minimal threats. There are frequent meltdowns. There are outbursts of angers which occur unpredictably. Incidents seem unprovoked. I want to give you a dramatic example that one of my colleagues told me about as to how that works. This was an incident that occurred in I think it was a 4th grade classroom. There was an 8-year-old boy who suddenly, out of nowhere, had just a major meltdown. He kept screaming, there's blood everywhere, there's danger, help me, help me, help me. There was someone had to come and take him to the social worker to calm him down and to try to find out what was going on. It took a lot of work on the social worker's part that day in order to unpack what happened to that child. So the child kept saying, the teacher has blood, the teacher has blood. So the social worker went to the classroom and she noticed that the teacher had a cup of coffee and the lipstick, the red lipstick, was on the cup of coffee. Okay, so in the child's mind, it replayed an image of his mother getting hit in the mouth and bleeding. So the trigger to all of this was this, unpredictable event. Nobody could have known what was happening. What this illustrates is that when kids who've been traumatized have meltdowns, there's usually a reason, but ferreting out what the reason is and how it occurred or where the trigger came from is probably very difficult, because unless you know much about their history, their home life, their background, you'd be hard put to guess at what caused that. So how we deal with that, we'll talk about in the strategies that I will illustrate, maybe ways of handling those incidents. Then there is pervasive anxiety. It's like your system is now on alert and cannot calm down. The anxiety sort of follows you everywhere you go. We call it, generally it's generalized anxiety. Sometimes it can translate into overt panic attacks where the child feels that he or she is dying, that their life is being threatened. So anxiety is another major element of a response to trauma that you carry with you. Now, I want to spend a little time on the problems of attention and concentration. And I chose this image of this child sort of looking away, daydreaming. There is a difference that we're going to talk about between kids who are ADD or ADHD, who have trouble with attention and concentration, and kids whose attention and concentration is disrupted because of the trauma. Okay, I'm going to give a label to what happens in psychological terms. We call that dissociation. It's withdrawal into fantasy. Let me sort of play out a little bit. So here's this 6 or 7 or 8-year-old little girl. She is being chronically molested. She is helpless. She can't fight, certainly. She can't run away. There's no option for that. So what do you do under those circumstances? We talked about physically, you play dead, right? But what happens to you emotionally? Well, emotionally, you go inward. You go inward into fantasy. You know, women I've talked to who were sexually molested, you know, would say, you know, I kept looking at the wallpaper next to my bed and imagining things like I was watching a movie while I was being raped. Okay, so there's a dissociation, which it means that you withdraw into fantasy and you try to survive merely by sort of keeping your sanity. Now, there's a complication here because sometimes when the abuse have been chronic and severe, and in some personalities, what we have is the emergence of what used to be called multiple personalities. The mechanism here is that you are assaulted, you withdraw, you pretend you are someone else, and you create a different world from the one that you live in. Okay. Now, how that sometimes manifests in classroom is you get kids who suddenly produce these horrific drawings that are full of mayhem and aggression. You know, I've had teachers who have come and said, "Oh my God, what do I do with this kid? You know, is he a danger?" It's not so much that the kid is a danger, but that there's a flood of aggressive energy, and it finds expressions in the drawings, or writing essays if they're asked to write. So teachers get, you know, very upset when they get these essays full of death and aggression and mayhem, and they don't know where that's coming from. I would guess that 9 times out of 10, those kids were traumatized, and this was their way of expressing, you know, or reliving what was going on in their lives. So we'll talk later about what you can do with dissociation, but it's a big problem. And the important thing is to distinguish, you know, ADHD, problems in attention, concentration, and dissociation. It looks very much overtly like that because the kids aren't following what's going on. You know, they seem to be daydreaming, and you sort of wonder, you know, where they are. All right, so disrupted relationships. One of the major things that I've learned about kids who've been molested, sexually abused, or maltreated is that they feel betrayed. The notion of betrayal is a very powerful one. It's like the adults who are supposed to protect me, in fact, failed. They harmed me, they injured me. And so how can I trust anybody? So if you carry with you this feeling of being betrayed, your sense of trust in any adults is totally undermined. You know, you feel, how can I distinguish whom I can trust and whom I cannot trust, whether it's friends or adults? You know, well, if you're carrying those feelings with you, you're going to have a lot of trouble with relationships, because you may get assaultive to somebody who is trying to be friendly, because you can't say, can I trust this kid, or is he after me, he's going to injure me, he's going to bully me. Okay, so in those kids who've been traumatized, there's this preoccupation, and Sometimes it leads to avoidance of relationships. Sometimes it leads to chaotic and conflictful relationships. Finally, we get to narrative confusion. Narratives are very important at all levels. They shape who we are, they shape who we want to be, they sort of tie up elements in our autobiographies. They are a thread that ties the various beads of our lives together. And so if we haven't suffered from a serious trauma, we identify with people, we keep them in mind, and we have stories that we make up and that help us in the future in how we progress. So having a coherent narrative, having an intact narrative is very important to having a sense of self where you can have self-confidence, where you can have pride in who you are, where you can feel you can accomplish things. It gives you a sense of stability that you carry with you. Now, if you've suffered a trauma, it's hard to have that kind of coherent narrative. You can't generate a good story. It's like, a TV program where you missed half the series and there's this gap in between that you can't fill in. And the gap has to do with the trauma. Whether it's a single event, multiple, or cumulative trauma, the ability to make sense of your life is disrupted. And as we talked, it's not just that cognitively you can't, it is that what needs to have been stored for you to have access to be able to build this story is not available to you. So having a coherent narrative or restoring a coherent narrative is going to be very much a part of what we need to attend to when we talk about interventions. All right, so just to briefly review the psychological responses: the loss of feeling of safety, the dysregulation of emotion, the anxiety, the problems of attention, concentration, the relationships that are disrupted, and narrative confusion. Okay, so now take a deep breath and get to number 4, which is the interventions, which is, I think, what many of you would like to have strategies. Let me move up to something I want to. All right. As a preface to interventions, I want to say something that may run counter to some of what you are used to doing. I'm often asked, can I have a set of tools, a toolbox from which to draw and apply to situations? Now, the difficulty I have with a toolbox, even though I'm going to recommend a book of toolkits for trauma, is that it does not help unless you understand what's going on in the child. My focus really is on understanding. If you can understand, you will know what to do. If you're trying to just apply tools to behaviors the mismatch, the danger of a mismatch between what you're bringing and what the child needs is higher than if you understand what the child is going through. So keep this in mind. While I'm going to go through some suggestions, my focus is to help you understand the child and to have empathy for what's going on in the child as the critical part of what you need in order to be able to help that child. All right, so now there are, all these interventions, okay? Reestablish a sense of safety, explain to the child how their body and their mind responds to trauma, help with regulation of their feelings, provide strategies for anxiety and stress management, deal with the dissociation, that is the problem of attention and concentration, stress social engagement, building interpersonal skills, assist in weaving a narrative, and finally encourage activities. We will go through a list of activities. Okay, so how do you reestablish the sense of safety? I like this picture because it gives the sense of someone who is comfortable with themselves, who loves the children, who sort of exudes the sense of trust, okay? And so building a safe and caring environment is essential as a building block to helping the child feel, yes, the classroom is going to be a safe place. The school is going to be a safe place. We're going to make sure that nothing bad happens here. We're going to make sure that you're not bullied, that, measures will be taken if somebody does something to harm you, okay? And then progressing in the relationship by building trust, demonstrating to the child that they can trust you, so that slowly the child can come to feel that you are a safe person. You are not the same as others who have harmed me and hurt me. I can begin to feel, that I can be here with you without fearing what's going to happen. Maintaining empathy. To my mind, empathy is the human quality we need most in all of relationships, but in particular in kids who have been traumatized. Empathy with those kids sometimes is difficult to maintain because of the unpredictability of their behavior. It's like you think you understand, you think you've reached them, and all of a sudden everything falls apart. That's part of the syndrome. That's part of the disturbance. That stability for those kids is something they haven't experienced. And even though you are trying to maintain this safe environment, this caring environment, things will happen to disrupt them because of cues that they've gotten from someplace, internally sometimes, externally sometimes, that will lead to those meltdowns or aggressive episodes. Avoid being punitive. I don't know that I need to say much about that. Being judgmental and punitive does not get you anywhere. Then always be authentic. Teachers I've taught to and social workers say, well, I have a role to play, and I am a person. I think the more genuine you can be, the more you can be yourself, the more likely it is that the kid will sense that and be able to turn to you and trust you. Finally, establishing predictable routines. I think that's part of the school environment. And I think that's, we don't need to say much about that. All right. Explain how the body and the brain responds. Now, I think this section probably is more relevant to the social workers among you than the teachers. But if the classroom teachers will bear with me while I talk social work stuff, you will learn something, but I think, so a child comes and has been suffering a trauma. What we found is that the more they can understand about their bodies and how their bodies respond, including how their brains respond, the more, how should I say, relieved they will feel. And here is how it works. When a child, is disrupted physically or is disrupted because they can't make sense, they will go to dark places to fill in the blanks. They will go to all kinds of imagined things as to why they are feeling the way they are. When they have an explanation as to, hey, the reason your body is generating adrenaline is because when you see danger, your little smoke detector in your brain lights up and tells you. It gives them something very concrete to hold on to and to be able to sort of explain to themselves, this is what's happening to me. I can understand that. And they don't need to go to those other places to seek for explanations of what's happening to them. Explaining to them the fight-flight response also is helpful. In particular, and we're going to come back to that, explaining the freeze response and the business of dissociation, to my mind, helps kids because it relieves some of the anxiety they feel and says, yeah, I may not be able to run, I may not be able to fight back, but at least I know what I'm trying to do in order to cope with this, horrendous environment in which I find myself. Helping with regulation of feelings. Here, I'm trying to imagine, you're in the classroom or you're seeing a child who's having a meltdown. And I know that spontaneously, what we say to the child is calm down. That's the last thing you want to say to a child, because if they could calm down, they would calm down. So you're saying to them, calm down, does not help a bit. So what you have to do is you yourself convey to the child that you are feeling calm and you're feeling okay, and you can deflect their attention from their upset by saying, okay, let's try to find something pleasant that you can feel so that you don't feel so bad. I know you're feeling terrible. Let's find a way to make those feelings go away. And I'll suggest some things later on in terms of how you can do that, in terms of breathing and in terms of guided imagery, which can help. The essential point here is what we've learned is that co-regulation works. If you stay calm, if you talk softly and gently and empathize, then that conveys a message to the child that they're going to be okay and that they can calm down and get regulated again. All right, so dealing with anxiety and stress. The first thing about dealing with anxiety is that you have to imagine this child being in considerable pain. Okay, so in my work, when I used to see children, and I knew how much pain they were in, I would imagine, what would it be like to hold and cuddle this child in order to convey the sense of, I am with you, I care for you. We can't touch, we can't hold them, we can't obviously sit them on our laps and calm them as we would if they were our child. What I'm conveying here is, if you are able to imagine that for that child, it's a beginning. Then we have a couple of techniques that are helpful. Again, instead of saying calm down, you say to the child, take a deep breath, hold it, hold it, hold it, let it go, let it go, let it go. Let's do that about 5 times. Let's do that about 10 times. Breathing, as we know now, the slow breathing helps regulate anxiety. It helps calm people down. So breathing exercises, as they're called, usually the ideal way to teach breathing exercises is to say to the child, okay, breathe in and count till 5 if you can, and hold your breath. Breathe out through your mouth and count till 5. Okay, then start over. Breathe in, count till 5, hold it. Breathe out, count till 5, let go. That, can begin to diminish the anxiety. The other technique, I think, is more appropriate for maybe a one-to-one relationship with a social worker, is what we call guided imagery. And I'll give you an example to illustrate how that works. A parent brought a child whom I had been seeing, who was having nightmares and who was having terrible anxieties. So again, trying to create a safe environment with the child. The mother was there. This was a 7-year-old child. And I said to the child, okay, we're going to do a little exercise. Okay, I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to tell me what you are imagining as you close your eyes. And the kid closed his eyes and he said, I'm seeing a forest fire. I'm seeing a house that's burning. I said, okay, all right, now hold that image a minute. Now, what I want you to do is imagine that you're hearing a fire siren and a fire truck approaching. And I'm going to be the fireman, and I have a big hose, and I'm going to put out the fire. You're going to help me put out the fire. There was a sigh of relief as he imagined that, and the kid calmed down. So he took that with him. Whenever he felt anxious, he could imagine my being there, sort of in his imagination, trying to help him calm down. Guided imagery is a whole technique. It's very useful. This is just a snippet of an example of how it can work. Another way it can work is, if you have an anxious child, where you say, okay, close your eyes, imagine the nicest place you've been, or the most fun place you've been. Think about that, and then describe to me what it was like. A kid might describe swimming, being in an amusement park, wherever. What it does is help regulate the anxiety and manage the stress the child is under. Okay, now dealing with dissociation, as I said, psychologically, this is the most complicated thing because it becomes so habitual in children that they become reliant on sort of shutting down, going away in a space where they feel, quote, relatively safe. They're playing dead to whoever is assaulting them. And so overtly, I think what you're noticing is, quote, they're daydreaming, or they may be drawing, or they may be inattentive. If you know that the child doesn't have ADHD, you can probably be fairly sure that that child, is reliving some kind of trauma. And so how to draw them out from that becomes a big challenge. You can't do it by saying, well, stop daydreaming. You have to find some other way of saying, okay, something happened that made you anxious, made you scared. Okay, can we get back some of the feelings of safety and trust here? Can we bring you back, to be with us in a safe way? Again, it's difficult to do in a classroom situation. In a social work setting, you may be able to do that. One of the things that teachers and therapists respond to dissociation is it makes us anxious to see a kid go in some dark place where they're almost beyond reach because they have shut down. Either they're not communicating or they're not talking, they're telling us. And so to try to draw them out is really a difficult task and takes a lot of time, a lot of feeling safe. But I'm saying this to help you identify the problem. Dealing with it is more complicated and takes a lot of skill and a lot of of time before you can get to a place with the child to feel to give that up, or at least to not use that technique as much. I think social engagement, building interpersonal skills, I think the school settings are primary. Getting kids to have a buddy. If you know someone who's been traumatized, if you can find someone who can be a buddy for them, to be with them, to build peer relationships, to include them in groups. Obviously, there are a lot of activities where they can be included, but I'm sure you are all familiar with social emotional programs that are geared to trying to build social engagement. And so, I'm not going to go any further in that. I think the last thing is helping a child weave a narrative of what happened. Now, first, a word of caution. If you ask a child, tell me what happened, as we said, they're not going to be able to tell you because of the fragments. Secondly, when you ask for that, you're asking them to revive a lot of the feelings that they suffered during the trauma. So I would be cautious about that unless you really feel that the child is in a good place. And then as classroom exercises, you can say, why don't you write a little story about what happened to you. In therapy with social workers, I think you're building the story together slowly from the bits and pieces that you're hearing. But don't be surprised if you don't get the whole thing, because as we have understood, the brain changes that have occurred do not help building the soul. Secondly, if they dissociated during the event, if they've gone away, they can't tell you what was going on because they're in a different place. However, there is value at some point for kids to help tell the story of what happened. And maybe it takes multiple versions of the story before they can feel comfortable enough to say, I understand, or I can remember, or, this is what happened to me, even though I know there's a lot that I can't remember or I can't put together. So if you do that, what's important is how you conclude the story. And here, I'm going to, all right, I'll come back to this in terms of how to bring closure to the story, which is an important thing. The element that I want to emphasize is hope for a better future. Hope that things will not repeat themselves and they will feel more grounded, feel better sense of self, feel more cohesive as they mature. So I'll come back to that. Okay. Now, there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which I recommend to social workers. I think teachers may find that a little bit daunting because it deals with some neurological aspects. However, Van der Kolk has been very helpful in contributing another dimension to helping people who have suffered trauma. And his recommendation is talking about it only partially helps. What helps is some activity that helps revive the feelings so that another form of expression can take place to give an outlet to all the feelings that have been built up. Okay? So art therapy or art, music, dance, theater, sports, leave out yoga and meditation for the time being. But I'm a great believer in theater. Theater permits kids to pretend something they are not. And in the process of doing that, they can allow themselves some free range to express whether it's their dissociative thoughts or their repressed thoughts that they haven't allowed themselves to think. Dance is another. Any of those programs in school, if kids are encouraged to participate in them as much as possible, those are healthy. And the yoga and meditation is more applicable to adults, although some people are trying to use meditative techniques with kids. Now, finally here, in terms of other activities, I want to say a word about EMDR, because some of you may have heard about it and wondered what it is and what it does. EMDR is a technique that has been used with a range of people with trauma, all the way from children to servicemen who have been seriously traumatized. And the technique itself is quite simple, although it takes training and skill to administer it. And we don't quite know how it works or why it works. But here it is. The person sits down next to the therapist or to the person who's going to administer the EMDR, and they're going to be told to follow the person's fingers. And all the therapist does is move back and forth and then says something about what are you feeling? What are you remembering? For some reason, this kind of technique helps bring up feelings that the person was not able to deal with before. And in the process of reprocessing those memories, it neutralizes them. The term is it detoxifies them. They're no longer toxic, and the person can overcome some of the damage done by the trauma. So I mentioned that in case you have heard about it and we're curious about it. So to summarize, we talked about safety, explaining how the body and brain works, regulating feelings, providing strategies for anxiety, dealing with dissociation, social engagement, assisting in a narrative, and encouraging other activities. Finally, I need to say this. Let me put it this way. The scars left by a trauma don't go away. What happens is you learn how to deal with them, right? So that all of these techniques are based on what we call neuroplasticity, the ability of the brain to reorganize itself to allow the person to deal with the brain changes that have occurred as a result of the trauma, so that there's a rebuilding that occurs. The scars are there, but a new layer is built that is healthy and allows for the person to move on in their lives. The biological and relational effect can be mitigated. They can be sort of attenuated. We haven't talked about medication. For kids, this is more problematic. Sometimes medication is recommended if the kid is highly anxious, and if you can find the right medication for it, it helps sort of tone down the hyper alertness and the anxiety. The other thing to keep in mind is this concept that we call resilience. Resilience, is positive functioning in the face of adversity. As I said, the scars will remain. We don't know all the elements that go into resilience. Some people seem to bounce back, some don't. I think you recognize those that do, and you encourage those aspects of their healthy self to sort of take charge and develop. I would like to think that there is an element of resilience in every child, and that it is variable. And so what you are hoping to achieve is reawakening the strengths that are innate and inherent in the child, and saying there's this healthy part of you that can move on and have a good life. So let's work for and hope for a better future. So this ties in then with the narrative aspect that I was saying, that in constructing the narrative, it's important to add an element of a hope for a better future in there as sort of as an incentive for the child to feel encouraged that they can overcome what they have suffered through. Traumatic experience can alter the brain, but so also can positive experiences. So the trust, the empathy that you provide, all of them sort of can enhance, hopefully, or begin to heal some of the damage that was done by the trauma. And finally, I want to mention 3 books which I recommend. The first one is Trauma-Informed Social Emotional Toolbox for Children and Adolescents, 116 worksheets. I've gone through that. Some of it is helpful. Some of it is just, filler. In any case, if you like toolboxes, then this book is for you. The second book is written by Oprah and Bruce Perry. Bruce Perry is a psychiatrist who's worked with children who've suffered from trauma for many years. He and Oprah have worked together for over 20 or 25 years, I believe. And so this book is a recent one, and I chose it because it's a recent one. It's published last year. And it's What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing. And they talk a lot about Oprah's trauma and her having been abused and neglected as a child and suffered losses. They also talk about kids. And Dr. Perry comes in with a lot of good recommendations and thoughts about how to deal with those situations. The third book also is just to come out, and I thought I would add that one, Children of and Complex Trauma, a Roadmap to Healing and Recovery. That book I included because it might be helpful to parents. It's written for foster parents by a Canadian person who's worked a lot with foster parents. But it's a good book if you have parents who are wanting to read about, or foster parents or grandparents who have kids they're raising. That would be a good book for them. Finally, as I said, I'm ambivalent about recommending Vanderkolk's book. The reason I'm puzzled about his book is it's been on the bestseller list of the New York Times for the past 89 weeks. Now, people who read the New York Times are maybe sophisticated, but I can't imagine, lay people reading that book. I think part of the attraction of the book is he gives a lot of examples. And it's possible that people sort of tie into the examples. Vanderkolk has worked with kids. In fact, he has an organization that he has started that deals with kids who have been traumatized. So he's very knowledgeable about that field and has made major contributions to the field. So this is my story, my narrative, and we have time now for questions and some discussion.
Thank you, Joe. Would you please just stop sharing at this moment so we can see you and everyone else who's on for the workshop. And you can unmute yourself and ask a question, or you may drop your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud. So please, the floor is open now for any questions.
Well, can someone reassure?
Ellen, I apologize. Ellen, did you have a question?
No,
Oh, okay.
no, I found it very interesting and very thought-provoking and very beneficial as a classroom teacher. So thank you.
I would like to be reassured that there are more people who feel the same way.
Thank you. Yes.
And
Hello,
yes,
my name is Clyde King, principal at Arthur Ashe. Thank you for this presentation. I have a question
yeah,
regarding support for staff members. How do I support staff members that experience trauma from a student, and I guess they fall within the realm of that hijacking, the amygdala or amygdala hijacking?
yes.
How do I support them?
So you're touching on a realm where I can't say that I have much experience, but staff support obviously is important, and usually what I believe is helpful is small groups to discuss their experiences and to discuss how they're handling the situations, so that they have an opportunity to process, what they go through as they try to deal with children, and how they themselves, have been affected by the children. I would categorize what they go through as cumulative trauma, because they are exposed on a day-to-day basis in having to deal with difficult kids and kids who themselves have suffered from trauma. So that, when you talk of supports, the one thing that comes to mind is sort of peer support is probably the one major. I don't know, does anyone else have any thoughts about this? This is a very good question that I hadn't come across. Anyone else have any questions?
Hi, my name is Tracy Wesson. I'm the social and emotional learning specialist for Chicago Public Schools Network 12, in which Ashe School is a part of. And we actually have some supports for adult SEL, social emotional learning, dealing with trauma. We have been really dealing with a lot of trauma that was unexpected when COVID hit, and it just brought out a lot for our school district, as well as, people around the world, of course. And
Yes.
so because of that, we have partnered with other organizations that have given us some resources to deal with adult trauma as well. So I just text Principal King to let him know that we need to talk, and we can go
Okay.
over some of the ideas. But a lot of the ideas and activities that you mentioned for children are also good for adults.
Okay, that's reassuring. Okay. I wondered about including something about COVID in this presentation.
What?
And
Okay.
I'm sorry. Oh, I thought somebody was making out. And I decided not to because it's a whole topic in itself. You know, I have great concern about the disruptions that kids have gone through as a result of not attending school, no socialization with other kids, the loss of academic skills. There's a huge concern about kids' isolation, you know, suicidal thoughts being more common in kids. Among colleagues, we've had a huge number of parents who are trying to seek help for kids because of the deprivations essentially that they've suffered during this pandemic. I think it deserves a whole other sort of kind of attention than the traumas that I have mentioned here. Anyone else? Well,
Any additional comments? Even if you don't have questions, feel free to share any comments that you may have now.
I don't know what to make of that. Let me ask you this. Could some of you tell me whether this material was too complicated? Was it too difficult? Are there areas where I could have given more examples or made it simpler? Will someone respond to that?
Hi, my name is Christina Bradley. I'm also at Arthur Ashe Elementary School. The information was not difficult at all. It was very concise and it was to the point. I think most of us may not have any questions because you did such a great job explaining it and actually breaking things down for us in ways that we can support our students. And that's very important right now with them returning to the building, of course, after being isolated for the past, nearly 2 years. However, I think one of the things for my school community at this time is also addressing the needs, being able to support our adults in the building as well. But as it was previously stated, many of the resources that you gave and the information that you gave can also be beneficial to support adults as well. So thank you.
Thank you. By the way, did everyone get the PDF of the slides? Did you all get copies?
Those of us who are here from Arthur Ashe Elementary School, we did not.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm uncertain why you didn't receive the slides, but if you would like a copy of the presentation, please do not hesitate to send an email request to Andrea Hall. I dropped her email address in the chat, but it's ahall@icsw.edu. Also, Joe, I wanted to share a few comments from the chat with you. In terms of your question about was the material too complicated, Ellen indicated no. I thought it was easy to understand as a classroom teacher. Exclamation point. Miss Lindsay Peluso said that she enjoyed learning why you shouldn't say calm down. I found that to be very helpful, Joe, why you shouldn't say calm down. Diamond Dodd indicated that she didn't think it was complicated. For someone who feels that psychology is too complex, I think it really helped me to understand trauma and different types of trauma.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I'm sorry you didn't get copies. I like to make those available to you because I think you can review them. And, I guess they weren't, well, anyway, I don't know what broke down, but you didn't.
If someone indicated that you can find them in the Canvas classroom, but again, do not hesitate to contact us directly. I'm uncertain what the Canvas classroom is. We coordinated with the Chicago Teachers Union Foundation, so it must be a system you have access to.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Any final comments or final questions from anyone?
Thank you.
Thank you.
You so much for attending.
Thank you.
Have a nice
Thank
evening.
you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yep. Thanks for everything. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Principal King.
I guess stay on, Michelle.
You have a lot of thank yous too in the chat, Joe, and excellent presentation in the chat as well.
Thank you. Well, I figured.
It was an excellent presentation. I thought it was very clear. Dean Safir was on also, and we were communicating back and forth, and he thought, he said to me, "You're doing a great job." So I think it was just a very clear presentation. The examples were helpful to me, just in terms of thinking about children who experience trauma. And then when you gave the example of how if someone has attention deficit disorder, you know that, and if not, they probably had a traumatic experience. That was really eye-opening to me.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, we had figured an hour and a half first, but I had expected more questions, but all right. Thank you much. And,
Andrea, did you have any feedback or comments you wanted to share?
No, I thought it was good though. And I think what you said about the calm down, I think that really resonated with me because I think that's a natural instinct. Like when someone's having a breakdown or a moment, we immediately rush to say, just calm down, just calm down. But it's like, obviously they bypassed that point. They're no longer calm. So what can we do to recenter them? My light is so bright. So I thought it was excellent. And I think maybe we do something like this again, we should just have discussion questions. So in the event that, like we can just have people, like if they don't have questions of their own, we can just have things that,